Hello, beautiful souls, and welcome back to another episode with Beyond the Mind with Ani. Today, we're going to talk about something that's been misrepresented for a very long time: sensitivity. Not the fragile, dramatic, too much kind, but the real biological intelligence that allows some people, especially women, to detect danger, misalignment, and imbalance before anyone else sees it. We'll explore why sensitive women have historically been targeted, how modern systems from relationships to capitalism exploit that generosity, and why unprotected sensitivity becomes a resource others can extract. This isn't about romanticizing feelings or blaming men. Please do not misunderstand this part. It is about understanding the mechanics of power, awareness, and survival in the world that rewards numbness and punishes perception. By the end of this episode, you see sensitivity not as weakness, but as your superpower, but only if you know how to protect it. So let's dive in. Allow me to start by correcting a lie that has been repeated for centuries. Sensitivity does not mean emotional instability, fragility, weakness, or being too much. Those labels were never neutral. This is what sensitivity actually means. When, as humans, you can do fast pattern recognition, you have a deep nervous system attunement and early detection of misalignment. So in biological terms, sensitive nervous system doesn't feel more because they're dramatic, they feel more because they can register more data. So, for example, a sensitive person can walk into a room and immediately notices, the tension behind that polite smile, the contradiction between words and tone, what's being managed rather than said. And this isn't intuition in a mystical sense. This is real-time information processing. And here's why this becomes a problem. Because sensitive people often notice that a relationship is unsafe before it becomes abusive, that a connection is exploitative before it actually shows. And the thing is, systems do not reward early detection, they reward compliance and silence. So what happens? The sensitive person is told, you are imagining things, you are overreacting, you're too emotional, relax, everyone else is fine. But everyone else is fine because they're numb, not because nothing is wrong. And I know this firsthand because I was a very sensitive child myself and I didn't have the language for what I was picking up. I just absorbed everything, moods, tensions, emotional undercurrents, and it was very overwhelming because no one really taught me how to filter, regulate, or protect that level of information. So instead of asking what is this child perceiving, the world asks, what is wrong with her? Sensitivity doesn't threaten system because it is weak. It threatens them because it exposes cracks before they can be managed. Think about it. Whistleblowers aren't punished for being wrong. They're punished for being early. Women who sense danger aren't dismissed because they lack logic. They're dismissed because acknowledging them would require change. Children labeled too sensitive are often the ones to notice emotional neglect, hypocrisy, instability at home, and instead of fixing the environment, we pathologize that child because it's easier to gaslight a nervous system than to restructure a system. So when society tells you your sensitivity is the problem, what they're really saying is this: your awareness is inconvenient for me. And this is where our conversation really begins. So let's talk about why women were mainly targeted. Women were not suppressed because they were weak. They were suppressed because they were informationally dangerous. And what do I mean by that? Highly sensitive people, especially women, have always been the first to notice abuse before it becomes visible, exploitation before it is normalized, danger before it has a name. They didn't need theories to know something was wrong. They felt it in their body, that gut feeling, and that made them the problem. Historically, women were the ones who noticed when power crossed into cruelty, sensed when authorities became corrupt, and felt when system extracted more than they gave. So I want us to ask ourselves, if a system depends on obedience, predictability, and silence, what do you do when people who can feel the truth before it is announced? You reframe them. You label intuition as emotional. You rename perception as overthinking. You call boundaries selfish. You turn self-sacrifice into virtue and reward numbness as maturity. A woman who senses exploitation becomes difficult. A woman who names incoherence becomes dramatic. A woman who refuses to dissociate becomes unstable. And slowly, things start to shift. Sensitivity doesn't get erased, it gets redirected. Women are taught to feel everything, carry everyone, doubt themselves, and still perform calmly. And that's not accidental. That is resource management. Because a woman who trusts her perception is very hard to exploit. A woman who feels danger early on is hard to control. And a woman who listens to her nervous system doesn't wait for permission. So instead of changing the system, we trained women to override themselves. We told them, be softer, be patient, be more understanding. Don't make this uncomfortable. And then we call that culture. But let's name it correctly. That is not culture. That is control mechanics. So let's look at this from the lens of capitalism. Capitalism doesn't just sell products. It sells regulation substitutes. Instead of teaching people how to regulate their nervous system, their boundaries, their attachment patterns, it often offers shortcuts. If you're anxious, buy certainty. If you're lonely, buy romance. If you're disconnected, buy spirituality packaged for consumption. Romance is sold as salvation. Work is sold as human worth. Suffering is reframed as virtue. Endurance is mislabeled as love. And sensitive people are especially vulnerable to this. Why? Because sensitive nervous systems are already attuned to others. They already feel tension. They already scan for harmony. They already overfunction to keep systems stable. So what happens? A sensitive person in a relationship will over-explain instead of exit, self-blame instead of confront, stay longer to understand, confuse emotional intensity with depth. A sensitive person at work, for example, absorb dysfunction as responsibility, stay loyal to environments that drains them, burn out quietly while being praised as dedicated. And you know what? Capitalism loves this because sensitivity, when is unprotected, becomes extractable. Your empathy becomes unpaid labor. Your intuition becomes emotional servicing. Your patience becomes available at all times, and your capacity to feel becomes something others profit from. And then, here's the real twist. When you collapse, the system doesn't question itself, it diagnoses you. You're the one who is too emotional. You're not resilient enough. You don't have good boundaries. You need another course, another coach, another fix. So sensitivity is never honored as intelligence. It's either exploited or pathologized. And this is why so many people, in my opinion, mistake depletion for devotion. Why they think love should hurt, why they believe that exhaustion is personal failure instead of systemic outcome. Because when a system depends on extraction, it cannot afford people who regulate, perceive early, and leave on time. Sensitivity was never the flaw. Unprotected sensitivity is simply profitable, and that's not love. That is capitalism. Before we talk about healing the feminine or redefining the masculine, we need to name what's actually broken. And the problem is not masculinity. Please do not misunderstand this. I love masculinity. I love masculine men. The problem is unregulated masculinity. Healthy masculine energy is stabilizing. It's amazing. It holds direction, containment, protection, and presence. But unregulated masculine systems don't lead. They push. They prioritize output over coherence. They value productivity more than integrity. They suppress feedback instead of integrating it. They treat sensitivity as inefficiency, not intelligence. And you see this everywhere. In workplaces where burnout is praised as commitment, in relationships where emotional availability is called neediness, in cultures where slowing down is framed as weakness. Now, let's talk about the other side. The unprotected feminine systems don't collapse because they are weak. They collapse because they absorb too much. They carry emotional labor for everyone. They override their own boundaries to maintain harmony. They sense dysfunction early but stay silent to avoid conflict. They confuse endurance with virtue. They call depletion love, loyalty, or being understanding. And this is where it becomes personal for many of us, including me. I know this pattern intimately because I lived it. Being sensitive meant I noticed tension before it was named. I felt shifts before they were acknowledged. And instead of being protected by that awareness, I learned to carry it alone. I learned to hold space, to explain things more gently, to translate discomfort into patience, not because I was superwoman, but because I was conditioned to do that. And truth bomb, when unregulated masculine system meets unprotected feminine system, something very predictable happens. One extracts, one collapses. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but systemically. One keeps moving forward without slowing down, and the other keeps adjusting without being met. And this dynamic is often labeled as chemistry, as passion, as polar attraction. But this is not polarity. True polarity requires regulation on both sides. Without regulation, direction becomes pressure, sensitivity becomes sacrifice. That's not masculine-feminine harmony. That is dysregulation, painted as romance. And the cost is always paid by the more sensitive person, emotionally, physically, neurologically, which is why the conversation isn't about choosing masculine or feminine role. It is about capacity, containment, and protection, because sensitivity without protection is not sacred, and strength without regulation is not safe. So how do we protect ourselves? Sensitive women are not failing because they're too open. They are struggling because they were taught that openness without discernment is virtue. But again, it is not. Sensitive women don't need to open more. They don't need to explain themselves better. Giving endless chances, trust someone's potentials. They need to select ruthlessly and early, because sensitivity without discernment becomes vulnerability, but sensitivity with discernment becomes power. Let me give you some examples from what I have personally witnessed and experienced. A sensitive woman enters a relationship where the connection feels intense. At first, there are deep conversations, vulnerability. There is this sense of, oh my God, finally someone saw me. But over time, she notices she's the one initiating emotional depth. She's holding space for his stress, confusion, and for his healing. She leaves conversation feeling more tired than nourished. And when she asks for consistency or clarity, she hears, "You're overthinking this. You are making big deal out of this. Why can't you just let things flow?" So she adjusts, softens, tries to explain better, but this is not love developing. This is a system learning how much it can take without giving. And when she finally stops regulating for him, when she emotionally decides to pull back, the connection collapses because the extraction stopped. So being overly patient, understanding, communicating, and softening your boundaries, this is not emotional intelligence. I'm sorry to disappoint. That is training. Unregulated people are drawn to sensitive women because sensitivity stabilizes chaos. Emotional labor replaces accountability. This is how women get played, not because they are naive, but because women are biologically wired to be more generous due to our evolutionary conditioning, oxytocin driven bonding, and cultural reinforcement. Women's generosity becomes a biological resource that systems, social, economic, and relational, can exploit. In partnership, workplaces, or family structures, sensitive women are often played or taken advantage of because their nervous systems are wired to care, sense misalignment, and absorb emotional labor. So when I say protection, it doesn't look like building walls. It looks like very careful selection and boundaries, firm boundaries. And this is what selection, in my opinion, looks like. Noticing who becomes calm around you and who becomes entitled. Living at the first pattern, not the 10th time explaining things. Refusing emotional roles you were never hired for. Mothering men, choosing your nervous system safety over adrenaline, choosing consistency over intensity. Protection is not fear, it is data driven discernment. You're not supposed to share your sensitivity with everyone. Share it with someone who respects it and is capable of holding it without feeding on it. And here's the truth that us women don't get told early enough. If someone benefits from your sensitivity but resists your boundaries, they are not your partner. They're your consumers. And understanding that, that is where real self-respect begins. So my lovelies, here's the truth. Being sensitive is not a problem. Being generous is not a flaw. What is dangerous to you and to your system is when that generosity is unprotected, unselected, and absorbed by those who cannot hold it. Protection is not closing off, it is discernment. It is noticing who stabilizes you and who drains you. Living early, choosing consistency over chaos, and refusing to carry emotional labor that is not yours. Your awareness, your intuition, your nervous system, these are not weaknesses. They're data, signals, and power. And when treated as such, they become the foundation for freedom, clarity, and self-respect. So I want to thank you for being here, for lending me your ears. We're here to help each other rise and grow. If this episode resonated with you, I share more insight, tips, and behind-the-scene content on my Instagram account, which is the same, Beyond the Mind with Ani. So until next time, stay bold, stay fierce, and always go beyond the mind.